done more in the cause of peace for his people and Anglo-Americans who wandered through this area, even than she did. Paiutes, and Sarah was a northern Paiute, which is a distant cousin of our Nuuvi, southern Paiutes. Are not a huge tribe in population. Maybe when the first Anglo-Americans encountered them, there were 5,000. Scattered from, I lived 17 years in Victorville, California. That had become Paiute territory about the time of the Civil War. They had pushed some desert Serrano out of there. And their full brothers and sisters, the Chemehuevi, occupied most of the Mojave Desert to the Colorado River on both sides. Some of you know where Tuba City, Nevada, or Arizona is. Right in the middle of Navajo country now, but it was Paiute. And the Navajos and the Hopis stayed out of their territory unless they had permission. In fact, Navajo Mountain in Utah was not their territory and was a Paiute mountain and named that until the federal government helped the Navajo push Hopi and Paiutes away. There's still a Paiute town near Tuba City, but they get their government money through the Navajo organization. I was a wrestling coach a long time. I was a state champion wrestler in Utah, and I coached in California quite a while. And one of my good wrestlers was a Navajo kid who I got close enough to that when he wanted to swear at me, he called me a Hopi. It's not easy to reconstruct Paiute history. I've got a whole 600-page book that I've written, not submitted for publication yet, because I'm only to 1900. I don't want the right to last 116 years. I want Native Americans to write the part that they remembered and that they know. They don't have documents about the earlier part. Some of you know that the Latter-day Saints have a kind of a fetish about keeping diaries and writing their own history. And I only know Tosho, probably, because I've studied the history of my great-great-grandfather, who was the founder and first mayor of San Bernardino, California, which was the largest Mormon town outside of Salt Lake City in the 1850s. And he passed through here at least 6 times in the 6 years he lived down there. He had 8 wives. 4 of them lived in Salt Lake City, and 4 were down there with him. He visited the others. And since he was a Mormon apostle, he came home to Salt Lake for quorum hierarchy meetings once in a while. He was very loyal to San Bernardino. He would like to have stayed there. Asked Brigham Young if he could. Was told yes, but it turned out to be no, because Brigham Young got in a war with the United States government, who sent an army to Utah. And when that happened, they closed the town of San Bernardino. I started coming to Mesquite trying to promote the Old Spanish Trail, which comes right through here, which has some of its most important locations very close here. I just told her that I've probably shown Virgin Hill, 6 miles west of here, to almost 1,000 people in the last 10 years. The old Spanish Trail isn't Spanish, it's Mexican, but it connects two Hispanic towns, Los Angeles and Santa Fe. Long and crooked and difficult. It was never used by wagons. It was always pack mules. But it was used every year from 1829 to 1848. That year, the gringos took this whole region away from Mexico. The Mexican Cession after the Mexican War. And the old Spanish Trail became sort of illegal, at least New Mexico trade, although they were all part of the United States by then too. But that's the very year, just weeks after we got it, gold was discovered near Sutter's Fort, or up on the American River, not too far from there. And when James K. Polk announced that in his State of the Union message at the end of 1848, the gold rush began within a month. And although there would be hundreds of thousands of people take the northern route, basically I-80 to the Sacramento, California area, I estimate about 10,000, most of whom knew about what happened to the Donner Party in the snow of the Sierras in 1846. When they got to Salt Lake City in mid-August, they decided, we're not going through the Sierras, we're going south on the all-weather route that was hot in the summer but not bad in the fall when they were going over it. And they could get to Southern California and still get to Northern California gold fields before the rain stopped, before anybody started mining gold anyway. There were probably 10,000 people came by our route in the years between 1849 and 59. Not all of them were miners. There were 3,000 Mormons in San Bernardino by 1857. And 2,000 of them are going to come back to Utah that year. 2 years after they start using the trail as a wagon route, at least from Utah Lake, halfway on the old Spanish Trail, now called the Southern Route, not the Mormon route, as some call it, because over half are not, and not the 49er route, because at least 3,000 of the 10,000 are LDS. They don't start until the spring of 1851, the third year. 150 wagons, 437 people. And when they leave Utah Lake in March 1851, they're organized. And they did something really smart for the 400 miles of desert that only have 10 places to get water in 400 miles. So they're 40 miles across, or apart. And some of them have names like Amargosa, which is almost the same as Lye, and Salt Springs and Bitter Springs, but they will keep you alive if you know where the springs are. But some, like some Stump Springs, just barely into California from Nevada, is a seep. If you have all 400 people there waiting to get a drink, there'll be a lot of fighting. So they had the sense, and you probably never heard of pioneers doing this, to spread out into subgroups of 10 wagons, at least a half hour apart. So there aren't more than 80 people, 10 wagons and teams at any one time at any spring. And they are still close enough that if they get in trouble, and they don't have trouble with Indians very much, Native Americans, they can signal, and others will be there within a half hour from each direction. Throughout this whole period, the Native Americans were not well respected as far as paying a toll for using their trail and their water and their grass. Paiutes and others learned to collect their own toll. You wouldn't believe how good shots they were with a bow and arrow. Not trying to kill anybody, but to wound an oxen or a sheep or even a horse, which would then be left for them to butcher and eat. That was the toll. And it was legitimate, I think, but it sure caused a lot of hatred toward people who owned those animals and had refused to pay. They would have paid a toll to Anglos, and the Native Americans knew that, but they weren't. When Amasa Lyman's group of 10, and he's not even the leader, gets to the springs at Las Vegas, the main springs where the waterworks is, he's already heard of the company behind that's back at, some of you know where Lorenzi Park is, further north, east in Vegas, and a smaller spring. He goes back to lecture to people that he's heard have killed a couple of Native Americans who stole from him. And he really chews them out. And it looks to me as a historian like that started a trend of better treatment of Native Americans along that southern route, at least by LDS, who were only a third of the people using it. Very soon, the Indians differentiate between Mormonese and Americans. And I believe it started a friendship that lasted throughout the 20-year period that we're looking at here. The next year, after San Bernardino's been founded and the cordial relationship started to grow, at least two different Mormon companies allow Native American men to come in at evening time and eat with them if they'll leave their bows and arrows with the wagon captain. They even spend the night relaxed and not tense. Within another year or two, they'll be hired to tend the livestock through the night with promises that they'll bring all of the animals back safely in the morning, take them to better feed and water for the night, and receive some pay for that. After 3 years, Brigham Young starts a project of calling lay missionaries from their homes up on the Wasatch Front between Ogden and Provo, Utah, Salt Lake City being in the middle of that, to come to New Harmony, where the Black Ridge is, between Cedar City and St. George, to the first Southern Indian mission that the church established in the spring of 1854. And the next year, others are called to establish one at Las Vegas. And they don't work really well because those 2 years, 54, 55, were famine times in Utah. Partly drought, but partly grasshoppers and crickets that eat a whole lot of wheat and corn stalks before they're mature. And the new Indian mission needs a backup supply of food. The Indians have known enough religious missions to know it's a good deal for them. They're going to have more food around, even before they learn how to grow their own. And the Indians along this part of the trail knew how, including the ones on the Muddy. They were the champion farmers of all. They had dams and irrigation ditches, as did the Tonakins on the Santa Clara River near St. George. They were the champion agriculturalists in my opinion, in the whole West. I'm giving a talk this coming Saturday up by the Fremont Indian State Park in Utah about Jedediah Smith, who visited the Paiutes, both the Tonakins and Santa Clara, and the Moapas on the Muddy in 1826 and again in 1827. And he had seen the whole West. He had visited the Mandans on the Missouri River in South Dakota. And he said that this was by far the most advanced technology of any Native American agriculture. And they've never gotten any credit for it. But they do deserve it because they are way ahead. They want more techniques. They want better strains of seed. They want better techniques. They're not even using hoes, let alone plows. In fact, when a field of corn grows and they harvest the corn and use some of the stalks for their wickiups, they don't have a way that they've figured out to get the old roots out of that field, so they abandon it and start a new field and probably don't come back to it for 4 or 5 years. And maybe some of the best land and that close to the river is then vacant. And so these Mormon missionaries very quickly say, what they need more than anything else before we ever preach religion to them is better farming techniques, especially plows. And they will get those. The problem is they skip the Moapas. Las Vegas isn't as good a farmland as Moapa is. I don't know of any better farmland than Moapa. I know that Mormon pioneers, before they abandoned it because it was in Nevada, and that was Brigham Young's fault because he tried to take another degree longitude of Nevada, and Congress turned it around and took a degree of Utah. So Nevada is 2 degrees larger than Brigham Young wanted it to be. And the 500 Mormons who lived along the Muddy River by then, 1871, left and went back to Utah. When you could grow 7 crops of alfalfa at Overton. I grew up on a farm in Utah where we were lucky to get 3, more than twice as much, a longer growing season, and better water. I shake my head every time I read about them leaving just because Brigham Young advised it, because they were getting charged extra taxes by the miners in the Nevada legislature. Nevada's a state by then, and they didn't deserve to be as far as population is concerned, but they've got the power and they're using it. And some Mormons further north up in Meadow Valley stayed and did fine. But the ones that were on the Muddy left and went, of all places, to Long Valley, Utah, which is just the other side of Zion's Canyon. Orderville and Mount Carmel and Glendale. Up in the mountains, some of my favorite Indians lived there, Paiutes, Kaibab Paiutes. And these people that had just moved from the Muddy River were kind of prejudiced against Indians by then. And I say that it's kind of the kiss of death to my favorite Paiutes, that these anti-Paiute people became their neighbors. I don't see much history of those Paiutes after that. Moapa should have had their own Mormon Indian mission, but they never did. And both New Harmony and Vegas failed within 3 years. By then, the New Harmony missionaries, led by Jacob Hamblin, have moved to Tonakin on the Santa Clara, and it's successful for 3 years. Those Indians call themselves Paiute Mormons. But then they think it's too tough to live that different way of life, and they declare that they can't do it. They're going to be Paiutes, but maybe their kids can. There isn't much dedication to missionary work in that area after that, but Jacob Hamblin moves over to Kanab And that will be successful for another few years. Like I said, the failure of these missions is partly lack of support of the mission by the rest of the church, Brigham Young's fault, but it is a famine time, and he's worried about it. He didn't want to admit it to very many people, that he'd led them to a promised land that isn't productive every year. But that is what happened, and Las Vegas, even though those Paiutes really were willing to work for 2 squash a day, there just weren't enough. And when they start pilfering from the field, because it is their land, they've given permission for the missionaries to come, which they never did in Utah. They were invited to Santa Clara, but not to the Cedar City, Iron County area. The relations aren't as good as they could be. And the other problem is that 9/11, 1857, is Mountain Meadows Massacre. And the Mormons invited some Paiutes to join with them in that for some of the loot, cattle, rifles. But up at the killing site, the Mormons decided to blame the whole thing on the Indians. For 150 years, until just the last 10 or 15, the Indians have been blamed for something that they were invited to be involved in, but were not the leaders of in any way. Now, by the time that happened, President James Buchanan had sent an army toward Utah, not to punish Brigham Young. He hadn't done anything yet. He was the official governor. But to replace him with the guy from Georgia named Alfred Cumming. And Brigham Young wasn't told, so he assumed they were coming to hang him. So he's going to declare martial law. The Mormons declared war on the United States. Fortunately, they never fought, because some more diplomatic people got there in time to make peace before the army didn't get there that fall, 57, because the Mormons learned how to slow them down, burning their wagons, stealing their livestock, and waiting for the snow to catch them out in the plains of Wyoming, which it did. And by spring, Buchanan's pardoned Brigham Young and the Mormons, and has ordered that the army not stop in Salt Lake, but march right through and then down west of Utah Lake, where they'll have a fort, but not have as much contact with the Latter-day Saints. Now, all during this time, Tosho hasn't been mentioned. He's been around. Lyman, whom I said traveled the route at least 5 and probably 6 times, had gotten to know a Native American of the Moapa tribe who lived very close to Mesquite. I don't know where. But he is here, and they visit every once in a while. And now, after San Bernardino's been closed and Lyman's back in Utah, he's sent back down through this area with a load of grain in sacks that he leaves with Tosho. Partly because he wants a supply of food for the 2,000 that are coming back from California that may need some food before they get to St. George, and partly to test Tosho, to see if he's still trustworthy, which he absolutely is, and probably some higher church leader told him to do it. Lyman probably knew that he absolutely was. Lyman and his group that are going on to the Colorado River to check on some steamboats that Lyman has got the government interested in using the river for, and the Mormons hope that they can be supplied by Colorado River. They think that it might be navigable up as far as where St. Thomas was, in the northernmost bay of Lake Mead. They can't get that far. They can get closer to where the dam, Hoover Dam, is, and there was a Colville and a big warehouse built there, stupidly, without the Mormons claiming the land. So some non-Mormon who owns the land also owns the Colville warehouse, which is never used before it's submerged under Lake Mead. The most difficult part of the wagon road from Salt Lake to Los Angeles is Virgin Hill, 6 miles west of Mesquite, Nevada, where many, many wagon trains had to work together. Each train will need about 15 wagons, each with a chain or a big rope that can be tied together, and they can take their mules and oxen up on the top of the mesa, and there's a long 300-yard ramp, steep ramp, where those several dozen draft animals are pulling each wagon up that ramp one at a time. It takes all day. It's the most difficult part of the trip. Now, Lyman's only got one wagon. The only way they're going to get up with this military reconnaissance patrol is for Tosho to talk some of his men into helping carry the freight up that grade without using the extra oxen and ropes and mules they don't have. And all they can pay them for doing it, which they do, is lots of crackers. That's the only rations the Mormons have, and they're sharing it with Tosho and his men, who are glad to cooperate. And the relationship that hasn't been used for about 3 years is full-fledged again. Now, another one of the evacuees from San Bernardino, who spends several weeks at the Mormon fort in Las Vegas, is Carolyn Barnes Crosby and her husband and son Alma, and several other pioneers, including her niece and a missionary who's been assigned back there after the mission was closed, just to keep peace between the Native Americans and the Mormons passing through, and the mail carriers who are passing through, until this evacuation from San Bernardino. 2,000 faithful Mormons have gotten back to Utah in the early months of 1858. Carolyn Crosby stays there for several weeks, partly because one of their oxen was stolen by, they thought, Moapa Indians, not Las Vegas Indians. The head chief over all of them before Tosho, who will be by the 1870s but wasn't in 1858, lives, you know where Indian Springs is? It's about 25 miles northwest of Vegas. And the head chief there is over even the Moapas at that time. And he pinpoints that it's probably Moapas that stole the Crosby's oxen. Carolyn saw enough cooperation from these Paiutes that she, even though she was an uptight New England middle-aged lady, had relaxed some and fed them and enjoyed their company some. And while she was there, she met Tosho's son. At least I think he's the son. His name's Amasa in English. Tosho has named one of his own sons after my great-great-grandfather. And Carolyn has sent him from the Muddy River to Vegas to help her sister, who's really a crotchety lady. Not very many people can get along with her. And the two muleteers that she has hired, the only ones that'll even work for, are too chicken when when mules and oxen are stolen by the Indians, these guys aren't going to go try and get them back, trade or anything else. They're too scared. And so Carolyn knows about her sister, and she knows she'll need help. This really faithful teenage Native American young man goes back to Vegas, and it's just my speculation. She's sending back to help Carolyn, who's going to be getting to the Muddy River after Carolyn leaves. And she's going to need help. In fact, when she gets to the Muddy, the Native Americans trade, and some of them volunteer to help, but some of them stole some of her oxen too. So that by the time she gets to Virgin Hill, which is Glendale, 5 miles from the Muddy River where the power plant is, that's the main crossing over on the other side of Mormon Mesa, 25 miles from here. They've still got to go up the mesa, not as steep as this side, but they've got to go up it, and then going across is difficult because there's no water. There's a lot of good sand grass. In fact, one of the places is called Sand Grass Camp. When you're going across that mesa, just before you start down the other side, look off to the right, to the north, and see all of that grass. But it's got another problem. The rocks up on top of that mesa on this end are so sharp that lots of oxen are shod right there. You know what an ox shoe looks like? They've got a cloven hoof, haven't they? So it's 2 little pieces on each foot. And that's not easy. I've even read in the diaries of herds of sheep that when they get to the sandgrass camp are grazing on their knees because they're so lame. You've probably seen a T-shirt somewhere with Hollister written on it. That's the name of a town in California. The guy that founded the town drove sheep through here. And his diary is the one that says they were on their knees when we got over there. They made it. They recovered on the Muddy River. But it's not an easy journey. A lot of people get really discouraged when they get into the Mesquite, Moapa sector of their route. When Louisa Barnes Pratt, Carolyn's sister, gets up on that mesa, she did it using one giant ox pulling a whole wagon that's got her dishes and her books and a stove. That's a heavy load. One ox. And she knows it's getting tired. It died when it got to the top. Now, she's got another wagon with a good team, and they can go on. What are they going to do with this one with no draft animals? Her hired men are going to dig a pit called a vault and bury the stuff in it until they can bring fresh draft animals down to hitch onto her team and reload the stuff in another week. But how are they ever going to get word? There is a group that's traveling the other way from Santa Clara, and they maybe made the suggestion, send this Indian kid. So Louisa drafted a letter pleading with the Santa Clara Mormon bishop, whom she knew, William Crosby, not related to her brother-in-law, to send some fresh draft animals. In the meantime, she and her teamsters will move on down the road. After this young Indian, Amasa, is given some rations and the letter to deliver, and he took off running. And he never stopped until he got that message delivered 70 miles away. And then he comes back, and they reward him with the new costume, new shirt, pants, shoes. They let him eat with them, which is really a big deal. especially for uptight New Englanders like Louisa Barnes Pratt is. They wanted him to go back with them and kind of be a foster son. But he's learned that their enemies, their cousin enemies, the Utes, who will capture lots of Paiute children and women and sell them to New Mexicans as slaves, would also be interested in a teenage Paiute boy. So he's not going back into the Ute territory. He's going to stay where it's safer with his dad's band or sub-band of Moapas on the Virgin River near Mesquite, which is his home area. So they tell him goodbye, and they have fond feelings for him, and he's been heroic. But he doesn't go with them. There's not much contact after that evacuation of Mormons from San Bernardino. In subsequent years, Tosho and Amasa and other Paiutes won't see many Mormons in their area until St. George's established in 1862, and Santa Clara had a few Mormon missionaries and some Paiute Mormons, and Washington City was started in 1857 also, partly a few people that stayed there when they came back from San Bernardino, including that Bishop William Crosby. But it's not until 1865, 3 years later, when Brigham Young has called other Mormons to come down and settle on the Muddy River, that the lead apostle in St. George, a guy named Erastus Snow, and his scribe, his mission clerk, a guy named James Godson Blake, come from St. George to Beaver Dam, just named Millerville, for the first 6 Mormon settlers that settled near where Littlefield is now. And by that time, Snow knows that he's blundered some by not negotiating with the Paiutes before the settlers start. And some of the Indians are pretty angry, including Tosho, who by that time is head chief over the Moapa band. All of the area from Beaver Dam to the upper Muddy River, all the way down to where the Virgin and the Muddy join, near St. Thomas, that northernmost bay of Lake Mead. So it's a huge domain. Tosho's the head chief. And he's heard that some of the Moapas have been cheated in trade deals in St. George, and he's angry about that. And some of the St. George Native Americans have said, these Mormon leaders are coming to poison the river to kill you, which is a lie. But some Indians believe it, and Tosho, when he meets James G. Blake, seems angry as far as Blake's concerned. Blake doesn't know, and he doesn't ever learn to like Indians much. But he says Tosho's angry, calls him Toshiob. He's got a great historical source, the best one on Washington County, Utah, but not very good on Indians. But he describes Tosho as being angry at the beginning, but as Apostle Erastus Snow explains, he feels better. And they get along, and Snow won't admit to him, but he'll admit to others. He should have been down there negotiating and being a diplomat when the first whites settled on Moapa land. Not much trouble that year, 1865, but the next year, 1866, is a main trouble year because the Paiutes, at least a few, planned an amazing livestock stealing raid. Anybody that reads their history cannot say they're timid, cannot say that they can't figure really brilliant things out. St. Joseph, which is a town near Logandale and Overton now, is where there had been a slough, a swamp on the Muddy River. And then there's an island, and two branches of the Muddy River go around that island. It's quite large, and it's a great place, the Mormons think, to pasture their cattle where they can't be stolen. But what if some really smart Indians bring in a temporary bridge that they can erect in the dark opposite from St. Joseph? They took 60 horses and cattle off that island and headed for Pahrump Valley. Or, do you know where Potempayut Valley is? It's just west of there. But there's a lot of desert between. But these Indians have hid huge amounts of water in containers out there where they can water the stolen livestock and get them on through to the mountains. So the Mormons the next morning, when they find out, and they don't have many of their good riding horses left, head out, go 60 miles, but they don't have a supply of water for their livestock. And they don't know their way around those mountains out by Pahrump. They give up and come back, and they're angry. And when they look around, they see most of the Native Americans have left. They've even pulled up their unripened wheat from their field and taken it with them. But not the Indians that are south of St. Joseph, where Tosho is, and where Chief Thomas is. They're still there. In fact, there had been some cattle stolen down at St. Thomas, and I think because Tosho used his influence, they never got to the herd that got driven away. They were rescued and given back to their owners. There are a lot of angry owners because pretty tough to do your plowing if all your plow oxen and horses are gone. And they know these people will come back sometime, but they're gonna make them sorry that they've done that and promise they'll never do it again before they come back. In the meantime, and it'll be 4 months, the raid took place in about the last of January, 1866, and they don't get back, most of these Moapas don't get back till about April or May. And by then, Tosho has done a lot of negotiating. And the first thing he and two of the other chiefs, one of them is Thomas, and the other name isn't mentioned in the sources, they compared notes, what they can find out among other Native Americans that they can talk to. The first thing they find out is that the people that planned this were really careful to make sure the leaders friendly to the Mormons didn't hear anything about this. Now, there had been a Mormon leader who had been told by an Indian, you better watch your cattle more closely than you've been doing. He was ignored. But that had been a warning. These three chiefs figured out that the two ringleaders from their band, the Moapa band, were longtime thieves, incorrigible thieves, named Toquap and Stambo. Have you ever heard the name Toquap? Yes, you have. There's a huge wash just west of town that goes a long ways north. I think it came from this Indian. I don't know how much the Mormons looked for him after his own chiefs had indicted him. And they and the Mormons had tried him and found him guilty in absentia. They probably looked for several weeks, but he was laying low. When both he and Stambo are captured, it's by immigrants passing through that the Mormons have described these Tutu, and probably neither of the Indian men is as careful with the immigrants as they are with the Mormons. So it's just less than a month before some immigrants crossing at the ford near the power plant, before they start up California Wash, heading for Vegas, Toquap comes up and begs for bread. He's recognized and captured, given over to the Mormon authorities, chained under a bowery, which is shade. They don't have any trees, do they? They don't even have any very good houses yet. And that'll be a problem because they're going to sentence him to be hanged. How do you hang somebody in St. Joseph when there's not a tree within 30 miles? Or a two-story house. They did hang some Indians in this area from second-story windows later at Hyco, but not along the Muddy River. So they decided to take him to St. George. Now, in the meantime, one of the guards is a teenage kid named Price Nelson. And the first thing he records in his diary is that Toquap, terrible Freudian slip. The worst guy I can think of and the best guy I can think of. Mixed them up. Toquap tried to get Price Nelson to let him go. But he also swore that he would keep stealing as long as he lived. Incorrigible. There's no way that he's going to pay any attention to these Mormon punishments, which are mostly whipping. So they decide to take him by wagon over Mormon Mesa. I think that it's when he's coming down the slope on this side where they've had so much trouble pulling wagons up all these times that Toquap gets away. Price Nelson probably wasn't there, but he heard about it, wrote it in his diary, says Toquap gave a war whoop, made a break for freedom, running at great speed, then jumping sideways, and running again and then jumping the other way. He almost got away, even though the guards were shooting their rifles the whole time. But before he got out of range, they hit and killed him. Now, the most famous Dixie historian in modern times is a guy named Andrew Carl Larson, who probably used this teenager's contemporary diary to conclude he escaped the noose, he didn't get hanged, to meet death by a bullet as he fled. And my theory, and I've got a footnote here that says it, I've got a manuscript of this talk that I just gave to her. It's over in the museum. It's completely rough. But I'm going to submit it to the Nevada Historical Society Quarterly, probably in about 6 months. First article since Sarah Winnemucca that they've ever had on Native Americans, I think. It will be available, but it's already available if you really want to look. Because we're sure not, I've got 30 pages here. We're not going to do that. Because we've already gone an hour. Haven't we? Yep, almost. And we're not going to go much more than that. Anyway, they killed him, they buried him, probably in that wash. And you can ask 100 people from Mesquite if they know where Toquap Wash is, and they'll all tell you, yeah. Ask them if they know who it's named for. They won't have a clue. But you know now. You know. Named for an outlaw. And it's a huge wash. It's the biggest one I know of. When I talked here last time, I talked about my old professor, Leroy Hafen, when he was a 12-year-old, rode with his brother in a freight wagon up Toquap Wash, and they took a right turn, and then they went up over a ridge into a gold mining camp that was up there during the very time when the railroad was being built through Meadow Valley Wash, 1903 to 1904. And they were selling goods from Bunkerville up there in that mining camp for triple what they could get anyplace else. But their road was in Toquap Wash, 30 miles from here. So it's part of the history, too. Meantime, the Moappas have to answer for the cattle that were stolen. And I'll just take a minute about Yambo, the other one. When he was brought in, he talked him into giving him another chance. But he very soon showed his meanness and his haughtiness, but nobody got around to executing him, although some of them talked about it. 2 years later, he talked some of the immigrants into letting him guard their livestock. And he comes back in the morning and reports, well, other Indians stole one of your mules. Sorry. One of the immigrants followed the mule tracks with some Indian moccasin tracks right to the side, out to where he had tied it or put it in a little pen. And then the guy came back and took a club and beat Stambo to death. And he probably deserved it, because when you steal somebody's transportation in the desert, you're killing them. And that's just the rules. And that's what happened to the other thief. Although it's almost impossible to find that story. I thought they took him to St. George to shoot him, and that some of them had decided to do it before they got there, because I could see no reference to him there. But then I looked more closely at this teenage diary, and there it was, 2 years later. So that's what happened to the two horse thieves. But now, what about answering for the 60 cattle and horses that have been stolen? Tosho is very worried that in the confrontation there won't be anybody that knows the Paiute language well enough. They've got a good translator, interpreter, a guy named Gibbons. But he's replaced Jacob Hamblin over at Pipe Springs when Hamblin got sick. So Tosho goes to the Mormon leaders and says, hey, we got to have him back before we have that meeting. And he was back in time. And first, Chief Thomas comes into the head Mormon at St. Thomas, a guy named Thomas Smith, town's named for him. I don't know why they named him Saint, but they did. St. George too. None of them are well known anymore, but they got the town's name that. They have preliminary negotiations, and they decide our big meeting's going to be in early June. There are about 8 Paiute chiefs, maybe 70 male warriors, and at least 60 Mormon leaders, some of whom have lost property. And by that time, Brigham Young has written a circular letter, because there have been some worse things happen in Utah. There's a war with the Utes up there called the Black Hawk War. It's the worst war in Utah history, Indian War. Paiutes are supposed to be neutral, but I say 60 of them were killed. In fact, I gave a talk in Circleville, Utah, 6 months ago. This week, they're dedicating a monument, the Historical Society and the Paiutes, to the 30 that were killed by Mormon militia, wrongly, in Circleville. And there were that many more up at a place called Burville. In fact, it's called a squaw fight because most of the victims are women and children up there. And I'm going to start working this next week on them getting a monument too, and it'll happen. Back in St. Thomas, where this meeting's being held, not just Young has said, don't you punish anybody that's innocent, but even Erastus Snow and George A. Smith, the main militia guy for southern Utah, have written a really sympathetic, fair-minded letter saying, hey, Mormon cattle have almost wiped out their main staple of their diet. The staple of the Paiute diet, as I probably said 2 months ago, is grass and weed seeds that they grind into flour and make porridge and mix with meat or mix with berries. And in 1 year, Mormon livestock wiped that staple out. And these guys know it, and they're saying, you gotta be lenient with these cattle thieves. You've taken their deer and some of their staple of their diet. Go easy on them. But when they finally get in the meeting, he doesn't show that side. Before they're finished, there's a sentence that if anybody steals a cow or a horse, they'll be killed. There never will be any on the Muddy River that have that happen. There are a couple guys, Native Americans, one's named Ocus and one's named Bushhead, up in Meadow Valley, but one has talked the other into killing a miner, Rogers. So it's not just cattle stealing, but there is a capital punishment for larceny passed by the Mormon hierarchy in Nevada. It's never in Utah. Brigham Young has denounced it earlier, but he didn't say anything about it this time. And it's easy, and professional historians sometimes have to read between the lines. There's no cordiality between Native Americans and Mormons after that rule. The Mormons will still be there another 5 years, 1866 to 1871. But there won't be the kind of relaxed cordiality that there had been before. And when they leave, they left a crop growing in the fields that 3 non-Mormon guys bought from them, and it was a bigger harvest than you'd usually get in crops in California. They made a lot of money on it. And some of those guys, who are no friends of the Mormons, can be seen quoting to government officials that in that 5 years of tension, the Mormon farmers probably donated to the Indians 1/4 of their produce, a huge amount of what they earned to feed Indians at a time when there's a Civil War veteran who's the Indian agent, and he's moved from St. Thomas, where there are lots of Native Americans, to Pioche, where there aren't hardly any, but there are some brothels and some saloons and some gambling dens, and that's where the Indian money's going, through him. And the Mormons know it, and they're trying to compensate by keeping these people alive when his corruption is keeping the Indians from getting anything. And it's not a known fact, but I absolutely believe that that was one of the hallmarks, even at a time when there's tension, before they move. And when they move out of Overton, the Indians burned the town, because they didn't want these outsiders occupying those farms and Mormon houses. They did it anyway in the other 2 towns, St. Joseph and St. Thomas, but it wasn't as bad as the Indians thought it was going to be. The most amazing thing, and this will be the last thing I talk about, after the Mormons have been gone from the Muddy, and there's been almost starvation by Moapa Paiutes, there is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in historical sources. Tosho was approached by some Army officers from Fort Mojave, which is over by Needles and Laughlin, to go to an Indian reservation along the Colorado, and he didn't want to do it. And so he negotiated with these Army officers, especially a Lieutenant Colonel William R. Price, for an alternative. And the alternative is something that he had done other times. One Mormon freighter who wrote his life story, a guy named Silas Cox, says that in 1862 he came on another group of immigrants at Sandgraf's camp up on Mormon Mesa, and they were feeding the Indians. And then he saw Tosho tied with ropes under one of the wagons. He was the hostage. He had negotiated. You take me as the guarantee that my people will be fair to you and not hostile. You feed them. From that 1862 and other practices like it, he had worked out a treaty with the Army. Him and 5 other chiefs, including the main one from Santa Clara, Tutsagabats, and the main one from Las Vegas, Tosho, and 3 others that I don't recognize. They're not Indians from up this way. They're from further south. They had worked out a deal where there would be some hostages kept at the fort over on the Colorado to assure the safety of immigrants still passing through. And if those people hired Paiutes to help them or felt like feeding them, there would be guarantees on both sides of safety. And if any Paiute misbehaved, they were to be reported to Fort Mojave also. This treaty of peace and security lasted for more than a year. I don't think it's ever been mentioned in any history book. Now, Harry Reid's got a good friend that's my friend also. He's a guy named Dennis Casebeer, who's written a lot about the Mojave Road, the road from San Bernardino to the Colorado River. And Harry Reid has written about his hometown. Anybody know where that is? It's out that way. Dennis Casebeer's home now is Goff's, just into California. An old schoolhouse has become an archive. And in that archive are all of the records and photographs from this treaty. This guy used to work for the Navy. There was an installation at Norco, California, in by Riverside in San Bernardino. And Casebeer would go back to Washington, D.C. once a month. And he became a genius at locating old Army records, including for El Dorado Canyon in Nevada and several other things. If you went to UNLV, you could find 6 books by Dennis Casebeer, including the one about Camp Rock Springs that has this treaty in it. But the archives are there at Goff's, and this treaty lasted more than a year. It didn't keep peace in California very well. And fairly soon, the armies pulled out of Fort Mojave, and the whole thing falls apart. And sadder than that, I lose track of Tosho. He's probably over 50 by then. The Mormons don't have contact, so he's not in their good records. Nobody else recognizes him as newspapers. There aren't any newspapers between San Bernardino and St. George during this period of time. There are none in this part of Nevada. There would be in just a little while at Vegas, but not yet. I know that there's some horrible epidemics, that measles is especially tough on Moapas. But smallpox, I've seen where Paiutes in the San Bernardino area and the Mojave Desert of California are hit by that 4 times in 30 years, including 1877. There are actually Paiute Indians in the streets of San Bernardino laying there. As soon as their family and their loved ones see that they've got a disease, they escape for the mountains, hoping that they didn't get it. They don't think there's anything they can do for the people that have already got the telltale pox. And they die like flies. Some of the most famous Indians I know in Southern California died of measles or smallpox between 1862 and 1877, which is the years when Tosho disappears. I hope I can find him. But I have to end this story of one of my favorite people by saying he disappeared, probably died of a disease that he had no immunity to. But he had so much contact with whites who carry it, and this is before Louis Pasteur. They don't know what's causing disease, that he disappears without a record. Maybe you can help me find him. At least you know who he is now. And that's all I wanted to say tonight. I appreciate your attention. Most of you are really listening. Thank you very much. She said that I can try to answer your questions if you have some. I've told you everything I know. You can study that unprinted book. It's over in her museum. If you have questions, ask them. Anybody? You're tired. You've been listening too long. Nobody? Come up after if you want to. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, this is some history that should be written about.